The polished floors of a downtown bank reflected more than just light. They mirrored the quiet tension of a place where people came and went without expecting anything unusual. An elderly woman approached the counter with nothing more than a slip of paper in her hand, yet her presence would set off a chain of events no one could have imagined. What appeared ordinary at first glance was about to twist into something unforgettable. Customers shifted in line, unaware that they were standing on the edge of a moment that would test not just one woman's patience, but the conscience of everyone who watched. Arrogance was about to rise, silence would weigh heavily, and the stage for a confrontation was being built without a single voice raised in warning. The cruelty would seem small at first, but it would grow until it could no longer be ignored. Every passing second pulled the room closer to a reckoning, a collision between dignity and disdain that would leave no witness unchanged. When the truth finally surfaced, it would not only shatter arrogance but force everyone present to question their own choices. Before we dive into the heart of the story, make sure to like and subscribe for more powerful narratives, and share in the comments where you're watching from and what you think of this unfolding drama. The air was thick with the smell of ink and faint polish from the floors, the place designed to project efficiency and modernity. Among the waiting crowd, a black elderly woman named Evelyn Harris entered with steady but deliberate steps, her cane tapping against the tiles. She wore a pale gray coat, her silver hair tied back neatly, glasses perched on her nose, and a calm, dignified expression that seemed to hold decades of patience. She was the kind of woman who carried herself with quiet authority, though to the unobservant eye she looked like any ordinary grandmother who might be running errands on a weekday morning. In her hands was a deposit slip she had carefully filled out at a side desk. Her handwriting formed with deliberate loops that were clear but perhaps not stylish, a product of age and a lifetime of steady hands that now trembled slightly. Evelyn stepped forward when her turn came, placing the slip gently on the counter where Megan Wright, a teller in her late 20s, sat tapping her manicured nails against the desktop. Megan was sharp-featured, with a blouse crisply ironed and hair styled in a sleek bun, the kind of young employee who believed efficiency gave her the right to wield power over others. She glanced down at the slip, then back at Evelyn with a smirk curling on her lips. She raised her voice just enough to make sure it carried across the lobby and said, "This looks like a child scribbled it." The words echoed in the sterile air, cutting into Evelyn's dignity like a blade. A couple of younger customers in line snickered at the remark, not out of true amusement, but because they felt safe mocking someone older and vulnerable. Evelyn's eyes lowered, and she murmured softly, "I'm sorry," her voice barely above a whisper. Megan leaned back in her chair, exaggerated in her posture, enjoying the power imbalance. "People like you don't belong in a modern bank like this," she sneered, the disdain dripping from every syllable. The cruelty was not subtle. It was designed to humiliate publicly, to turn the moment into a performance. The people around grew still, some with discomfort etched on their faces, others watching with silent complicity. Evelyn, standing there, felt the sting not only of insult, but of memory, because this was far from the first time her identity as an elderly black woman had been weaponized against her dignity. Megan tossed the deposit slip back across the counter carelessly, the corner bent as if even the paper itself were beneath her. "Honestly," she continued, "maybe practice your writing at home before you come in and waste everyone's time." The arrogance in her tone was like a slap, intended to cut Evelyn down to size in front of strangers. Evelyn's hand trembled slightly as she picked up the slip, smoothing it quietly as though restoring its order might steady her own emotions. Behind the counter, Megan's colleague, Chase Miller, looked over with a smirk, shaking his head with quiet laughter. It was clear they shared the same cruel amusement, feeding each other's contempt. The room felt heavy, as if every eye was on Evelyn, waiting to see if she would push back or retreat. She took in a long, slow breath and stood straighter, her cane firm on the floor. She did not meet Megan's eyes, but her silence was not weakness. It was composure, a choice to absorb the blow without yielding her dignity. To those watching, it might have seemed like defeat, yet Evelyn had lived long enough to understand that arrogance left unchecked eventually revealed itself. She knew there was more power in restraint than in immediate retaliation. Still, the cruelty weighed on her shoulders. Megan leaned forward again, her tone thick with mock concern. "Do you need me to explain how to write your name?" she said, loud enough that even the security guard at the door turned his head. A few people in line shifted uneasily, a man behind Evelyn frowning as though wanting to intervene but hesitating, unsure if speaking up would make things worse. The unspoken tension hung in the air, stretching every second longer. Evelyn remained still, her lips pressed tightly together, her heart aching with the familiar bitterness of discrimination. She thought of all the times in her life she had been underestimated, insulted, or ignored, and how each time she had chosen to endure rather than strike back in anger. Megan leaned across the counter, her lips twisting into another smirk, and she let her voice rise so the people waiting in line could hear every word. "You can't expect me to process this kind of handwriting," she announced, shaking the slip like it was trash. "It's a mess, and I shouldn't have to waste my time." The words, sharp and calculated, rippled through the lobby, drawing more eyes toward Evelyn. A few customers chuckled again, emboldened by Megan's tone, while others looked away uncomfortably, unwilling to confront what was happening. Evelyn's cheeks flushed, but her posture stayed tall, her cane rooted to the floor like an anchor. She had faced humiliation before in her long life, but each time carried its own unique sting. Megan, noticing the slight color in Evelyn's face, pressed harder, finding cruel satisfaction in her power. She tossed the slip down again, this time letting it slide nearly to the floor, forcing Evelyn to lean and retrieve it. When Evelyn bent carefully, balancing with her cane, Megan laughed softly and said, "You really should have stayed home. This is a modern place for people who know what they're doing, not for people who still write like it's the 1950s. Chase Miller, her co-worker at the next station, overheard and smirked, nodding as if to agree. Evelyn straightened again, deposit slip in hand, smoothing it gently, as if her patience could erase the folds caused by Megan's disdain. Her silence was her shield, but Megan mistook it for surrender. To her, the lack of protest meant permission to continue. She tapped her nails against the counter, then raised her chin, speaking loudly enough that the entire room could hear. "Maybe you should have someone else write for you. Surely there's someone in your family who can help." The line of customers shifted, some whispering to each other, some exchanging uneasy glances. A young woman near the back frowned, her discomfort clear, but she said nothing, intimidated by the setting and the authority of the teller. Megan reveled in the attention, her cruelty transforming the bank lobby into a stage. Evelyn, who had spent decades carrying herself with dignity through a world that often dismissed her, knew the tactic well. The humiliation was not only for her, but also to elevate Megan in the eyes of others. Yet Evelyn remained calm, her silence not weakness but strength. She had come here with a purpose that Megan could not see, and exposing the teller's true nature would only make that purpose clearer. Megan leaned back again, sighing dramatically, as though dealing with Evelyn were a burden beyond reason. She rolled her eyes and said, "Honestly, if I took handwriting like this, our records would be ruined. Do you even realize how hard it is to read this nonsense?" She looked around, inviting others to agree, and a pair of teenagers laughed awkwardly, eager to align themselves with the dominant voice in the room. Evelyn looked at the teller, her expression serene but her eyes sharp with quiet intelligence. Megan missed it, blinded by her arrogance. To her, Evelyn was nothing more than an old woman with shaky hands and poor handwriting, someone she could dismiss without consequence. That blindness was her downfall, though she didn't know it yet. Evelyn shifted her grip on her cane and straightened the deposit slip one more time, a small act of defiance masked as meekness. The gesture was simple, but it steadied her, reminding her of her resilience and her reason for being there. She could feel the weight of eyes upon her, the judgment, the pity, the laughter, all of it pressing down, but she refused to let it bend her spirit. Megan, dissatisfied with Evelyn's refusal to respond, escalated further. She turned to her coworker and, in a voice meant to carry, muttered, "She probably can't even spell her own name right." Chase chuckled, shaking his head. Evelyn heard it clearly, as did others standing in line. Each insult piled onto the last, painting a picture of arrogance so obvious that it was impossible to ignore. And still, Evelyn endured, her silence deliberate, her restraint purposeful. She knew there would come a moment when her true identity would surface, and every word Megan spoke now would echo back with devastating force. But for now, she let the scene unfold, her patience tested but unbroken. The cruelty was spreading, infecting the air with discomfort. But Evelyn understood something the others did not. Arrogance always exposes itself when given the chance. She was allowing Megan to dig her own pit deeper with each insult until the fall would be inevitable. Megan leaned back in her chair, her nails clicking against the desk like a metronome of arrogance, then leaned forward abruptly, her tone dripping with disdain. "You know," she said loudly enough for everyone in the line to hear, "we don't serve messy handwriting here. If you can't write properly, how do we even know this is real?" She flicked her gaze to the security guard, Tom Dillard, a broad man standing near the glass doors, and waved him over with a flick of her wrist. Tom walked closer, uncertain, his brow furrowed as he glanced at Evelyn, then at Megan. "What's the issue here?" he asked, his voice neutral but carrying authority. Megan thrust the deposit slip toward him, making a show of holding it like contaminated evidence. "Look at this signature," she scoffed. "It doesn't even look real. For all we know, she could be trying to pass off something fraudulent." The words landed heavily, and several customers craned their necks to get a better view, the murmurs rippling through the line. Evelyn stood still, her face calm, but her heart pounding with the weight of injustice. Her years of experience had taught her that false accusations could spread faster than truth, and now she stood at the center of one, her integrity questioned in a public arena. Tom studied the slip for a moment, clearly uncomfortable, then handed it back to Megan. "It's not my call," he muttered, "but I don't see anything wrong at a glance." Megan rolled her eyes dramatically, ensuring everyone saw her exasperation. "Of course you don't, but I'm the one responsible for keeping the records clean," she retorted, her voice rising. She turned back to Evelyn with a smirk. "Tell me, do you even know how to spell your name properly? Because from where I'm sitting, this looks like a joke." The cruelty stung not just because of the words, but because of the laughter that followed from a couple of younger men in the line, who chuckled nervously, eager to align themselves with the stronger voice in the room. Evelyn's chest tightened, but she did not let her expression falter. She had endured decades of slights, dismissals, and insults, each one etched into her memory, and while they had never stopped hurting, they had taught her resilience. Her silence was not weakness, it was discipline, and though Megan mistook it for surrender, Evelyn knew that patience could be sharper than any retort. Megan, dissatisfied with the lack of a reaction, pressed harder. "Maybe you should just say your information out loud," she said with feigned helpfulness, her tone mocking. "Go on, tell us your address, your date of birth, whatever you can manage. At least then we might get something legible." The suggestion was cruel in its intent, forcing Evelyn to expose personal details to a crowd of strangers, turning her transaction into a public spectacle. A hush fell over the line as people realized how far Megan was going, but no one moved to intervene. Evelyn tightened her grip on the slip, her cane steady beneath her hand, her dignity intact even as her privacy was stripped. She knew this was not the time to reveal her authority, not yet. Let the clerk dig deeper, she thought. Let her arrogance shine brighter, so that when the truth emerges, there will be no doubt about who she truly is and what she stands for. Megan leaned closer, her voice dropping to a sharp whisper only Evelyn could hear. "People like you always think you can get away with bending rules. Not today. Not with me." Evelyn met her gaze then, her eyes calm, unwavering, carrying the weight of years Megan could not comprehend. For the first time, Megan faltered, just slightly, a flicker of discomfort crossing her face before arrogance surged back to cover it. She turned to Chase Miller, her co-worker, who had been watching with an amused grin. "See what I mean?" she said to him, loud enough for the line to hear. "If we let this kind of handwriting into our system, our records will be a disaster. We might as well let children fill out deposit slips." Chase chuckled, shaking his head in agreement, the cruelty feeding on itself. The customers shifted uneasily again, some embarrassed, some complicit, all caught in the gravity of Megan's arrogance. Evelyn stood still, her silence not passive, but purposeful. She knew she was being tested, and she also knew that patience would expose the truth more powerfully than anger. She inhaled slowly, exhaled calmly, and waited, every insult stacking upon the last, every humiliation weaving into the fabric of a trap Megan did not realize she was creating for herself. Megan basked in her own cruelty, certain she had broken the woman before her. She straightened in her chair, satisfied that she had turned the transaction into a performance, one where she was the star and Evelyn was the object of mockery. "You'll just slow things down," Megan announced with a false smile, her tone meant to sound professional, but dripping with disdain. "We need to keep the line moving for customers who actually know how to fill out their forms." The remark drew uneasy glances from the people in line, but no one challenged her. The imbalance of power between teller and customer seemed to paralyze them into silence, and Megan relished the control. Evelyn stood quietly, her cane planted firmly against the polished tile, her eyes focused not on Megan but on the larger space of the bank, watching everything and everyone. She was not there only as a customer, and though Megan could not know it yet, every word spoken and every action taken was being mentally recorded. Megan leaned toward her coworker, Chase Miller, making sure her voice was low but not low enough to avoid being overheard. "She probably doesn't even have a real account," she muttered with a smirk. "These types usually just come in for welfare checks." Chase snickered, shaking his head, and the two shared a laugh that cut through the lobby like a blade. The cruelty was no longer just Megan's, it had spread, woven into the fabric of the workplace, reflecting a culture where arrogance and prejudice could flourish unchecked. Evelyn heard every word, her heart tightening, but her expression remained composed. She had lived too long, seen too much, to let the poison of such words show on her face. But inside, her patience grew heavier, not from weakness but from the discipline of choosing restraint until the right moment. Megan returned to her desk, taking her time with the papers in front of her, pretending to be too busy to assist Evelyn. Each minute of waiting was another insult, another attempt to reduce her to invisibility. Customers shuffled in the line, some annoyed at the delay, others quietly disgusted by the treatment unfolding before them. One older man at the back cleared his throat as though to speak, then fell silent, cowed by the tension. Megan finally looked back at Evelyn, feigning surprise. "Oh, are you still here?" she asked mockingly. "I thought maybe you gave up and went home." The word struck with deliberate cruelty, a dismissal that carried the weight of systemic disregard. It was not only about handwriting or a deposit slip, it was about power, about who was allowed to be seen and who was expected to fade away. Evelyn did not move. She held the deposit slip close, her cane steady, her back straight. Megan rolled her eyes and turned again to Chase. "It's ridiculous," she said, her tone pitched for the customers to hear. "If people can't keep up with the modern world, they shouldn't be here wasting our time. They need to understand this is a bank, not some charity office." Chase chuckled again, nodding as though agreeing with a simple truth, and Megan smirked at her own cleverness. The lobby had grown colder in spirit, the air heavy with complicity and unease. A few customers looked at Evelyn with pity, others with discomfort, but none with the courage to step forward. Megan's words had framed Evelyn not just as an incompetent customer, but as someone unworthy of service, and that framing hung in the air like a sentence no one dared challenge. Evelyn inhaled slowly, her chest rising with measured breath. She had walked into this bank knowing she would encounter the unexpected, but what she found here was more than unkindness. It was evidence of arrogance so ingrained that it flowed easily, unchecked, from one mouth to another. She knew she could not stop it with a single word, nor did she intend to. She was letting it build, letting the truth of this culture reveal itself in front of witnesses who would not be able to deny what they saw. Megan turned back at last, picking up Evelyn's slip with exaggerated reluctance. She studied it again, shaking her head. "It's still a mess," she said coldly. "If we allowed every slip like this, the whole system would fall apart. We have standards, and clearly you don't meet them." She placed the slip down again, flat and dismissive, as if it were nothing more than clutter on her desk. Evelyn's silence, her patience, her unshaken presence, it all unsettled Megan in a way she could not articulate. But rather than reflect, Megan doubled down, choosing cruelty over humility. To her, Evelyn was powerless, and Megan was determined to remind her of that with every word. Yet beneath the surface, the balance of power was already shifting. Evelyn's restraint was not surrender. She leaned forward across the counter, her voice pitched to Carrie, and with a sharp flick of her hand she pushed the deposit slip back toward Evelyn. "You know what, maybe we should do this differently," she said with a false sweetness. "Why don't you read your information out loud for everyone to hear? At least then we'll know it's correct." The suggestion was not only cruel but humiliating, stripping away Evelyn's privacy and dignity in front of strangers. The line of customers grew restless, some glancing at each other with disbelief, others staring silently at the elderly woman whose quiet presence had already endured so much. Evelyn hesitated for the briefest moment, her cane steady against the floor, her hands tightening around the slip. She had no intention of broadcasting her life details to a crowd, but Megan's insistence made refusal appear as though she had something to hide. "Go ahead," Megan pressed, her smirk widening. "Say it slowly so we can understand. Start with your name. Or is that too difficult too?" Laughter bubbled from a few younger customers, though it was uneasy, half-hearted, more nervous than genuine. They laughed not because the situation was funny, but because Megan's tone demanded it, because aligning themselves with her cruelty was easier than facing it. Evelyn's lips parted, her voice calm but firm as she began to recite the information. The sound of her own words, steady though weighted, filled the bank, and each syllable felt like a surrender to the spectacle Megan was staging. Still, Evelyn refused to let her voice shake. She had lived through harsher humiliations, and her strength was not easily broken. Megan, however, seemed emboldened by her compliance. "Louder," she said mockingly. "We can't hear you in the back. Don't mumble." Her colleague Chase chuckled again, shaking his head as though watching a comedy routine rather than a moment of cruelty. The security guard shifted uneasily nearby, his hands clasped in front of him, his eyes darting between Evelyn and the teller. He did not step in, perhaps out of fear of overstepping authority, perhaps out of habit of silence. Evelyn finished reciting the details, each word pressed out with quiet resolve, and when she lowered her eyes, Megan snatched the deposit slip from her hands. "Finally," she said dramatically. "That wasn't so hard, was it?" She picked up a pen, scribbled across the slip in large, messy letters, then slammed it down on the desk. "See? Even I can do it 10 times faster. That's how it's supposed to be done." The sound of the pen hitting the paper echoed like a gavel striking in judgment. Evelyn's hand trembled slightly as she reached for the slip, not from weakness but from anger she had kept buried beneath her calm surface. She steadied herself, smoothed the paper once more, and straightened her back. Her silence was still her weapon, but the restraint was becoming harder to hold. The cruelty had reached a level where even the customers who had laughed earlier were now looking away, ashamed of what they had joined. Megan, drunk on her own arrogance, turned to the line again. "This is exactly why we have standards," she declared, waving the slip in the air. "If we didn't, our records would be chaos, and some people clearly don't care about doing things properly." Her eyes darted toward Evelyn with a deliberate sneer, making sure the jab was clear. The room was silent except for the faint hum of machines, the quiet shifting of feet. No one dared to speak, though the discomfort was palpable. Evelyn's eyes lifted slowly, her gaze meeting Megan's, calm but piercing. For the first time, Megan faltered slightly under the weight of that look, though she quickly covered it with another smirk. She had no idea who she was speaking to, no inkling that the elderly black woman before her was not just a customer, but someone with authority far beyond what she could imagine. Evelyn let her gaze linger, then lowered it again, holding her silence, because patience was still the sharper blade. Each insult, each humiliation, was being stored, witnessed, recorded in the minds of everyone present. When the truth came, there would be no escape, no denial, no rewriting of the cruelty that had unfolded. Megan sat back, satisfied, her arrogance unshaken, believing she had completely broken the woman before her. Evelyn, however, stood taller than ever, her dignity intact, despite the weight of degradation. She had not spoken in her defense, not lashed out, not surrendered to anger. She had endured, and in that endurance, she had already shifted the balance of power without Megan realizing it. The deposit slip with Megan's scrawled handwriting lay in front of her, a symbol of humiliation that should have crushed her spirit, but Evelyn did not waver. She inhaled slowly, the years of patience she had cultivated steadying her voice, though she still said nothing in her defense. Megan misread the silence as defeat and leaned back in her chair, rolling her eyes for the benefit of her coworker Chase and the line of customers who were watching closely. "See?" she said loudly. "Some people need to be taught the hard way. You can't just walk in here with sloppy work and expect us to take it seriously." She looked at Evelyn again, her smirk widening. "I'm doing you a favor, really. Maybe next time you'll learn." The arrogance in her voice pressed deeper into the wound she had already opened, but Evelyn kept her composure. She knew the moment she had been waiting for was approaching, the moment when patience would no longer mean silence but revelation. She had not come here simply to deposit money. She had come here to inspect this branch, to observe the employees, to test the culture that either upheld or betrayed the values the bank claimed to represent. And Megan, without realizing it, had handed Evelyn all the evidence she needed. The shift began quietly, almost invisibly. An older gentleman in the line, tall with a worn cap in his hands, stepped forward just enough to be noticed. His voice was low but firm. "That's enough," he muttered, his brows furrowed. "She doesn't deserve that kind of treatment." For a moment, the lobby stilled, the words hanging like a challenge in the air. Megan turned sharply toward him, her eyes flashing with indignation, and snapped, "Mind your own business. I know what I'm doing. This is my job, and if you don't like it, you can wait outside." The sharpness in her voice startled even her coworker, who raised his brows but said nothing. The man in the cap stepped back, silenced but visibly unsettled by the confrontation. Megan smirked, satisfied that she had reasserted control, then turned back to Evelyn. "See? Even strangers can't help you. You just need to accept the standards we have here." Evelyn's lips pressed together, but she did not look away. Slowly, deliberately, she reached into her handbag. The motion was calm, unhurried, her fingers brushing against a small leather wallet before she withdrew a card encased in a clear badge holder. She placed it lightly on the counter, her hand steady, her expression unreadable. The badge bore the official seal of the bank's compliance division, with her name clearly printed, Evelyn Harris, Senior Compliance Inspector. The gleam of authority shone unmistakably from the badge, though Megan, blinded by arrogance, did not immediately register what she was looking at. She glanced down, saw the plastic, and let out a sharp laugh. "What's this supposed to be? A library card? You think waving something like this makes your handwriting any better?" Her voice dripped with contempt, and her smirk returned full force. A few customers leaned forward, curious, their eyes catching the words printed on the card, their murmurs beginning to spread. "Compliance Inspector," one whispered, and another nodded with recognition. The ripple began to move through the line, but Megan, deaf to anything but her own arrogance, laughed again. "Honestly, this is getting ridiculous. You're wasting my time and everyone else's too. Next time bring someone who can write for you." She shoved the card back toward Evelyn, who calmly slid it closer to herself without breaking eye contact. Evelyn's silence was deliberate, a patience sharpened into steel, and her badge, though dismissed by Megan, was beginning to spark realization in others. Chase leaned over slightly, catching sight of the name and title, his smirk faltering as the truth began to sink in. He swallowed hard, his eyes flicking nervously between Evelyn and Megan, but he said nothing. Megan, oblivious, continued her tirade, waving her pen like a weapon of authority she did not truly hold. "I've been working here for years," she declared, her tone theatrical. "I know the standards better than anyone, and I can tell you right now this isn't it." Her voice echoed, but instead of the approving chuckles she had grown accustomed to, there was only silence from the customers. The older gentleman in the cap stared at her with a look of grim satisfaction, as though he understood before anyone else what was about to happen. Evelyn did not move, did not respond, but her presence filled the space with a power Megan could not recognize. The truth had been placed in plain sight, and though Megan dismissed it, others had seen it, and the weight of that truth was already shifting the balance. Evelyn stood straighter, her hand resting lightly on her cane, her badge still visible. She knew the moment of revelation was close, that the arrogance around her had built itself so high it was ready to collapse. Her words rang through the lobby, but this time the usual nervous laughter didn't follow. Customers shifted uncomfortably, their eyes flicking between the badge and Evelyn's calm face. Whispers began to rise, quiet at first but growing steadily. "It says Inspector," one woman murmured. "She's an auditor," another added, recognition spreading like a spark in dry grass. Chase Miller leaned over Megan's shoulder, his smirk long gone, his eyes widening as he read the name. His stomach tightened. He had laughed at the insults, joined in the mockery, and now he realized the consequences of his silence. He leaned back quickly, pretending to focus on his own work, but his nervous glances betrayed him. Megan noticed none of this. She was too caught up in her own performance, her belief in her superiority so complete that she could not see the walls closing in. She leaned forward again, her eyes narrowing at Evelyn. "If you really were someone important," she said, her voice mocking, "you wouldn't be standing here struggling with a simple deposit slip. Don't waste my time with pretend titles." The arrogance in her words pushed the tension to its breaking point, and that was the moment the branch manager entered the lobby. His name was Richard Cole, a tall man in his 50s with graying hair and a dark suit that marked his authority. He had been on his way back from a meeting when he stepped through the glass doors and stopped cold at the sight before him. His eyes went first to Evelyn, then to the badge glinting on the counter, and recognition struck instantly. His face drained of color, then flushed red as the weight of what was happening dawned on him. He hurried forward, weaving through the line of customers who now stared in stunned silence, and approached the counter with urgency. "Inspector Harris," he said, his voice loud enough to carry across the room, "I had no idea you would be visiting us today." The words hit the lobby like a thunderclap. Gasps erupted from the customers, whispers turning into exclamations. The older gentleman in the cap who had tried to defend Evelyn earlier nodded slowly, his lips pressed together in grim satisfaction. Megan froze, her smirk collapsing into disbelief. She blinked, then shook her head, trying to recover. "Wait, what?" she stammered. "You mean, she's really?" Richard turned on her, his expression severe. "Yes, she is," he snapped. "And you will address her with the respect she deserves." The weight of his words silenced the entire room. Megan's face turned pale, her arrogance cracking into panic. She glanced around wildly, seeing the stares of customers who only minutes ago had laughed along with her cruelty, now looking at her with judgment and disgust. She opened her mouth to protest, to explain, but no words came. I didn't know," she whispered finally, her voice shaking. "I thought she was just—" Richard cut her off sharply. "That's the problem, isn't it? You thought, you assumed. And in doing so, you humiliated one of our most senior inspectors in front of an entire branch." His voice carried the weight of authority, and Megan shrank under it, her confidence gone. Chase sat frozen at his desk, wishing he could disappear, the laughter he had shared moments ago now heavy on his conscience. Evelyn stood silently through it all, her composure unbroken, her presence more powerful in its quiet dignity than any angry words could have been. She had allowed the arrogance to unfold fully, and now the truth had shattered it with undeniable force. Richard turned back to her, bowing his head slightly. "Inspector Harris, please forgive this disgraceful behavior," he said, his voice full of contrition. "It will be dealt with immediately." Evelyn inclined her head, her expression calm but her eyes sharp, taking in not only the manager's apology but also the shifting atmosphere around her. The customers who had laughed now avoided her gaze, shame written on their faces. The ones who had stayed silent shifted uneasily, wishing they had spoken sooner. And Megan, once so confident in her superiority, stood exposed, her arrogance stripped away, her downfall inevitable. She tried again to speak, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean I was just trying to follow standards," but Richard's glare silenced her. "Enough," he said firmly, "you've done more than enough." The silence that followed was thick, but it was no longer the silence of complicity. She glanced around desperately at the crowd of customers, searching for some sign of support, but the faces that had once laughed along with her cruelty now carried nothing but condemnation. Chase Miller sat stiff at his station, his hands frozen above his keyboard, the blood drained from his face as the reality of what he had enabled crashed down on him. The silence was broken only by Richard's firm command, "Step away from your desk, miss." "Right." His tone was flat and cold, not raised but deadly serious, and it carried across the lobby with an authority that silenced even the faintest whisper. Megan hesitated, her lips parting as though to argue, but Richard's glare cut her words before they could form. She rose slowly from her chair, the click of her heels against the tile sounding like hammers in the stillness of the bank. The smirk that had once defined her arrogance was gone, replaced with a trembling uncertainty, her hands shaking slightly as she tried to keep her composure. "Sir, she began, but Richard raised a hand sharply. "Not another word. You've humiliated an inspector of this institution in front of witnesses. You've violated every code of conduct this bank stands for. There is nothing you can say to excuse that." His words carried the weight of judgment, final and undeniable. Megan's eyes flicked toward Evelyn, her mouth opening again as though to beg for mercy, but Evelyn's gaze remained calm and unwavering, not cruel but resolute. The inspector did not need to gloat. did not need to speak. Her silence was louder than any rebuke, her presence a mirror reflecting Megan's cruelty back upon her. Customers began murmuring now, their whispers no longer aligned with Megan, but with Evelyn. "I can't believe she treated her like that," one woman muttered. "She made her read out her information," another whispered, horrified. The truth of what had happened was not only known but shared, the story already spreading among those who had witnessed it. One man pulled out his phone, quietly showing another customer that he had recorded the entire exchange, the video capturing every insult, every moment of humiliation, and now the reveal that the victim was no ordinary customer but an inspector with authority over the very branch that had mistreated her. Richard noticed the movement and closed his eyes briefly, knowing what that meant. By the end of the day, the footage would be online, and the bank's reputation would suffer not because of Evelyn, but because of the arrogance of one teller. He turned back to Megan. "Gather your belongings," he said curtly. "You will leave this branch immediately. Further disciplinary action will follow after an internal review, but as of this moment, you are relieved of duty." The words hit Megan like a physical blow. She staggered slightly, her hand gripping the edge of the desk for support, her lips trembling as though she wanted to argue, but couldn't summon the words. She looked around, desperate for someone to defend her, but every face she met turned away. Even Chase refused to look at her, his shame keeping him glued to his chair. The security guard, who had once stepped forward at her signal, now stood still, his eyes fixed firmly on her, no longer an ally, but an observer of her downfall. Slowly, mechanically, Megan collected her bag from beneath the desk. The sound of the zipper being pulled open echoed faintly in the hushed lobby, each movement magnified by the silence of those watching. She tried to keep her chin high, but her hands trembled, betraying the fear that now consumed her. When she finally straightened, her eyes met Evelyn's one last time. There was no hatred in Evelyn's gaze, no malice, only a steady calm that cut deeper than any cruel word. Megan swallowed hard, her throat dry, and lowered her eyes. She walked past the line of customers, each step slow and heavy, their stares burning into her as she made her way to the door. No one moved to comfort her. No one spoke in her defense. The woman who had wielded arrogance like a weapon just minutes before now walked out in disgrace, stripped of the power she had abused. The glass doors closed behind her, the sound final, sealing her exit. Richard exhaled heavily, then turned to Evelyn with an expression of regret. "Inspector Harris," he said, bowing his head slightly, "on behalf of this institution, I extend my deepest apologies for the treatment you endured today. It is unacceptable and will not be ignored." His voice was sincere, filled with the weight of a man who understood not only the damage to his branch, but also the moral failure that had just unfolded in plain sight. Evelyn inclined her head, her composure as steady as ever. She did not need to gloat, did not need to punish further. The spectacle had been punishment enough, and her silence carried the authority of someone who knew justice was already unfolding. Around the lobby, customers continued to whisper, some ashamed of their laughter, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The man who had recorded the video quietly lowered his phone, his expression serious. "People need to see this," he muttered to no one in particular, and a few nodded in agreement. Richard glanced at him but said nothing. He knew there was no stopping it now, and perhaps it was better that the truth spread. Evelyn looked around the lobby slowly, her eyes passing over the faces of the customers, the employees, the guard. Each one avoided her gaze, embarrassed by their silence, ashamed of their complicity. Chase Miller sat rigid at his desk, staring at his computer screen but unable to type a single word, the laughter he had shared with Megan only minutes earlier replaying in his mind like a damning echo. The security guard stood motionless, his arms crossed tightly, the authority he once lent to Megan's cruelty now transformed into a quiet acknowledgement of his own failure to intervene. Richard Cole, the branch manager, ran a hand through his graying hair and exhaled slowly, the responsibility of what had just transpired weighing down on his shoulders. He turned back to Evelyn Harris, bowing his head again in deference. "Inspector Harris," he said solemnly, "what you experienced here today was not only unacceptable but shameful. I assure you, it does not represent what this institution stands for." His words carried sincerity, but they also carried desperation. The desperation of a man who knew that the damage was not confined to the walls of this branch. Evelyn remained calm, her expression unreadable, her presence dignified. She did not rush to respond, and her silence spoke volumes. Richard swallowed and pressed on. "We will conduct a full internal review immediately. Training sessions on conduct and discrimination will be mandated for all staff. This kind of behavior will never be tolerated again." His words reached the customers in the lobby, who now listened intently, their faces etched with discomfort and recognition that they had witnessed a moral failing. The man in the cap who had spoken up earlier gave a small nod, his lips pressed tightly as though he approved, but also wished others had joined him sooner. Across the room, the young man who had recorded the scene on his phone tapped his screen, the glow of the device reflecting in his eyes. He whispered to the woman beside him, "This is going online. People need to see what happened." She nodded, her expression grim, understanding the magnitude of what had been captured. Within hours, the video would spread beyond these walls, exposing the truth to a wider audience, and the bank's reputation would suffer not because of Evelyn, but because of the arrogance and cruelty she had endured. Chase finally stirred, his voice low and trembling. "Sir, I didn't mean to." Richard raised a hand sharply, silencing him. "You stood by," Richard said firmly, his voice heavy with disappointment. "You laughed. You enabled it. That is complicity, and it is just as damaging. You will answer for your part as well." Chase lowered his head, shame washing over him, the weight of his inaction heavier than he had expected. He had thought himself harmless, merely a spectator, but now he realized that silence and laughter were weapons too. The customers continued to whisper, their voices weaving together into a chorus of recognition. "She kept her dignity," one man muttered. "Never raised her voice," another added, "and they mocked her for nothing. She was calm the whole time." The truth was undeniable now, and it carried with it a sense of reckoning. Evelyn stood quietly through it all, her cane steady, her eyes scanning the lobby. She saw the shame in the customers' faces, the regret in their lowered gazes, the unease in the employees who avoided her eyes. She had no need to lecture them. The moment itself was the lesson. The humiliation turned into justice. The arrogance collapsed under the weight of truth. Richard cleared his throat, his voice softer now. "Inspector Harris, I understand if you wish to file a formal report. I will provide you with any documentation you require. Please know that what happened here will be addressed at the highest level." Evelyn finally spoke, her voice calm, steady, carrying the authority of her years and her position. "The report will be filed," she said simply. "But more importantly, the culture here must change. This is not about one employee. It is about the silence that allowed her voice to dominate the room." Her words cut deeper than any reprimand Richard could have given, because they were true. Every person in the lobby felt the sting of them, the customers who had laughed, the ones who had stayed silent, the employees who had enabled the cruelty. Her statement left no room for excuses, no place to hide. The weight of responsibility hung in the air like a heavy curtain. Richard nodded solemnly. "Yes, Inspector, it will change. I will see to it personally." His voice carried conviction, but also fear. The fear of a man who knew the eyes of his superiors would soon be upon him once the report reached their desks, and once the video reached the public. The young man with the phone slipped it back into his pocket, his decision already made. The world beyond the bank would see what had happened, and justice would not only be internal but external, a reckoning that would ripple far beyond this single branch. Evelyn inclined her head slightly, acknowledging Richard's words but offering no comfort. She did not need to. Her very presence, her dignity maintained through the worst of humiliation, was the reminder of what justice looked like, not loud, not vengeful, but steady, undeniable, and complete. Megan's career was already in ruins. Chase's complicity would follow him like a shadow, and the bank itself would face scrutiny it had not prepared for. "Inspector Harris, please," he said, his voice softer now. "We will ensure this never happens again. I promise you, this branch will change." His words trembled with sincerity, but Evelyn knew promises were easy to make in the heat of shame. What mattered was whether those promises would live on when the weight of her presence was gone. She looked at him steadily and replied, her voice carrying the clarity of truth, "Promises are not enough. Change requires accountability, and accountability requires courage." The words pierced through the lobby, touching not only Richard, but every customer and employee who had witnessed the humiliation and remained silent until the truth revealed itself. Heads lowered, eyes averted, shame thick in the air. But Evelyn did not speak with cruelty. Her voice carried compassion, even as it demanded justice. She turned her gaze toward Chase, who had been complicit with his laughter, and though he could not meet her eyes, he felt the force of her words all the same. "You thought silence made you safe," she said evenly, "but silence is not neutral. Silence sides with cruelty. You saw what was happening, and you chose to join it. That choice will follow you until you choose differently." Chase swallowed hard, his throat tight with regret, his hands shaking slightly at his desk. Evelyn let her eyes drift then to the security guard, who had obeyed Megan's call instead of stepping in on his own. "Authority is not meant to be borrowed by arrogance," she said firmly. "It is meant to protect the vulnerable. You must remember that every time you put on that uniform." The guard nodded slowly, shame flooding his face, his earlier neutrality now exposed for what it had been, hesitation that had allowed cruelty to flourish. Evelyn finally turned to the customers, her voice softening but still carrying weight. "You all saw what was happening," she said. "Some of you laughed, some stayed silent, one tried to intervene, but all of you were witnesses. Never forget what it feels like to watch injustice unfold in front of you. Next time, do not wait for someone else to stand up. Be that someone." Her words lingered, sharp but compassionate, demanding reflection without condemnation. The older man in the cap who had spoken up earlier nodded solemnly, his face set with the recognition that he had done what little he could, but also with the regret that he had been alone in doing so. The younger woman near the back bit her lip, tears forming in her eyes, her silence now a burden she carried in her chest. The lesson had been delivered, not through anger but through truth. Richard exhaled, his eyes glassy with remorse, and nodded. "Yes, Inspector," he said quietly. "We will remember." Evelyn placed her badge back in her handbag, not as a dismissal of her role but as a reminder that she did not need to wield it constantly to be powerful. Her dignity had spoken for itself. She tapped her cane gently against the floor, the sound firm but not harsh, like a closing note in a symphony that had built from cruelty to justice to mercy. "Justice," she said softly, "is not about revenge, it is about fairness. Today you saw what unfairness looks like when it is allowed to thrive, and you saw how quickly it collapses when truth is revealed. Remember that lesson, and carry it beyond these walls." The customers nodded, some murmuring their agreement, others standing silently, the weight of her message settling into their hearts. The man with the phone who had recorded the incident looked at her with respect, realizing that what he held in his device was no longer just a video of cruelty, but a record of justice, a record of a lesson that needed to be shared with the world. Evelyn turned then toward the doors, her cane tapping rhythmically as she walked. The glass opened before her, the sunlight outside spilling into the lobby like a promise of renewal. She stepped into it calmly, her figure upright, her dignity unbroken, leaving behind a room filled with silence and reflection. The end. If this story kept you thinking about the way dignity can outlast cruelty, I'd love for you to support more stories like this by subscribing to the channel and hitting that like button. It really helps us keep bringing you narratives that matter. What did you think about the plot? Did the moment of revelation surprise you, or did you see it building all along? And I'm curious, where are you watching from right now? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. Your voice makes these stories stronger, and I can't wait to read what you have to say.